Thank you, truly, each of you for being here, students and colleagues. So like Lindsay mentioned, part of the Continuum Scholars Program is an opportunity for faculty like me to explore a sense of vocation and what that really means, and specifically how faith and research and the work that I do kind of intersect and come together. And so in thinking through what to put into this talk, there was a lot of different directions I could go. And I decided to sort of settle on one of the ways that I feel like I see my faith integrating with my work most right now, which is in terms of my sense of identity and kind of where I find my worth and value and how that then shapes how I do what I do. So today, in kind of putting together a roadmap of like what you can look for in the talk, I figured I would put up an actual map too, in case that's just helpful. So I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about my vocational journey, something I might not normally talk about in a research setting, but just to give you a little bit of background and hopefully to maybe highlight a couple things along this path, right, in college, grad school, postdoc, and then eventually ending up here at Hope, leading up to emphasizing a bit of what I mentioned of kind of how I think some of that identity development has taken place in me and how my faith kind of gives me a new, I think, more better and redeemed sense of identity. So I'll tell you a bit about that, how I'm recovering from what I would consider an achievement-based identity and trying to find that more in Christ. And then I'll spend the last part of the talk telling you more about the research that I do from this renewed sense of like purpose and calling in what I do. So here are some pictures of me and my family growing up. So it was me, my sister, and my mom and my dad. Does anyone want to guess which sister am I, the older or the younger? If you know, don't say it. Can you tell from the photos? Younger. Yes, I'm this one, yeah. So I grew up in Southern California. Growing up, I was really close with my mom, and my mom was an elementary school teacher. She took time off when we were young, while me and my sister were born through about end of elementary school and stayed home with us. And I think because I looked up to her so much, I just kind of imagined that I might always be a teacher. It just seemed like a great thing that she could do to take time off from that and still have something she could go back to if I ever wanted to raise a family or have like summers and holidays on the same schedule as my kids. So it was sort of what shaped my early career aspirations. But when I got closer to like graduating from high school, I started to really realize that I really had no clue what I actually wanted to do. And so when I was applying to colleges, one of the schools I applied to and got into was here in Pennsylvania. So I decided to do something a little out of the norm for me and go further away from home. And there, I was telling Lindsay just before this, it's a very different structure than at Hope. There you actually have to declare a major before you even start so that you can enroll in classes your freshman year. And so I declared biological sciences. For me, I had taken an AP bio class and I really liked it, and I like did well on the AP exam, and I think I was already starting to sort of sense that like I was good at academics, and that was sort of a sense of who I was. And so I thought, hey, I was good at this, I should pursue it. So that's what I started with. But as I also tell some of my students now, part of figuring out what you want to do is also maybe figuring out what you don't want to do. So Carnegie Mellon really emphasized undergraduate research. They really expected every student to be involved in it, and I got involved in bio research and realized as much as I love the concepts in biology, it was not necessarily for me. I spent lots of time plating cell cultures and growing yeast in warm water baths and splicing DNA, which is super cool, but just not exactly what I wanted to do. And it was around that same time that I took a child development class with this person right here, Dr. David Rackison, and he invited me after the class to join his research lab. So it was the first class I'd ever taken. It was a child development course, and he did research on infant cognition. So he studied how pretty young babies in their first year learn about the world around them. So I joined the lab with him, and here's what happened. I actually ended up doing kind of well at it, or at least that's kind of the feedback that I received. I did an honors thesis. I can tell you more about what causal perception looks like in young infants and how you test that maybe at another time or in the Q&A if you're interested. But I ended up getting my honors thesis published, and I kept getting these messages that like, oh, hey, you're good at this. You should just pursue academia, which is not something that I had ever considered up to this point. And honestly, at the time, I think the main thing that got me interested in it is it felt like maybe I could teach like I wanted to do growing up, and maybe academics have that like flexible schedule, right? You can still have summers off and not do anything and like have all the same holidays. Yes, I had no clue, no clue. But that's what I thought at the time. And also, I started to really put a lot of stock in the people that I worked with, like my advisor. And so when he said, hey, you might be good at this, I went with it. So I ended up applying for graduate schools, and one that I got accepted to was here, pretty close to where I grew up, and I went to UCLA. I was pursuing a PhD there. I joined another infant cognition lab, studying babies again. You can kind of see here some of my lab members. My second year, I joined a second lab there and got some experience with older kids as well, working with kids up to about 6 years of age in a language and cognitive development lab. And turns out, at least for me, grad school was also a time for me not just to focus on academics, but to have a little bit of fun. So I ended up also meeting a boy. This is my now husband, Jeff, proposing to me. This is us being silly at our wedding, having fun when I graduated and got my degree. And I mentioned this in part because normally I would not talk about this in a research context, but one of the things I've been learning and able to maybe express and name more, in part through going through the continuum program, is that for me, my sense of calling is more than just an occupation or career. It also involves the relationships that I have and prioritize in my life. And this was the start of a really major one that has shaped me. So, some other things, while I was in graduate school, I got to work with undergraduates. Now, for a lot of, maybe if there's even some students here who are thinking about going to graduate school, a lot of times in graduate school, you might get to be a teaching assistant or maybe even teach your own class and get some teaching experiences. I was not fortunate enough to have that. Instead, I was fortunate to get a lot of research grants. And what that meant for me was that actually I wasn't able to get a lot of teaching experience because those positions needed to be reserved for other students who needed that for their stipend. So the main way that I worked with undergraduates was as being a research mentor. And so, again, working in a baby lab, I actually got to work with a lot of undergraduates because it turns out in addition to all the maybe regular things you do in research, like collecting data and analyzing data and doing presentations like this, you also sometimes have to do things like feed a baby that's upset. So this is not my baby. This was just a research participant, changing diapers, scheduling and spending lots of time rescheduling appointments. We worked with infants here as young as 2 months of age, so like naps were a big thing. So all of that to say, I got to actually work with a lot of students who were so helpful, and that also started to cultivate in me, I think, a true enjoyment and a recognition that for me, a big part of what I found joy in was building those relationships, right? Even as I was navigating grad school and trying to figure out my life, trying to talk to other students about how they're navigating their lives. And that felt really meaningful to me. At the same time, however, I was also in an environment where my perception was that there wasn't a lot of value, I would say. That sounds unfortunate, but like a lot of the professors that I would see didn't spend a lot of time teaching and mentoring. If anything, what I tended to pick up on was professors who got really excited when they didn't have to teach as many classes that semester, or maybe using their research funds to buy out of teaching so that they wouldn't have to do that, or being really excited that they designed a class so that they could really spend as little time on it as possible. And in a context where like those were the messages that I had, and I was sort of a people pleaser at the time, actually I'm still a people pleaser, realizing that about myself. But I think it just made it really hard for me to be honest with the people who could have directed me and how to pursue what I really cared about. And instead, a lot of what I ended up doing was doing what I thought other people that were in that field would want me to do. And so that was a part of why after graduate school, instead of maybe applying for other teaching-focused positions, I instead went on to do a postdoc. So a postdoc, for maybe students, if you're not familiar, it's basically where you go and you're trying to learn new technical research skills, oftentimes so that you can be competitive to get a job at a really big research university where you can do cutting-edge research, get lots of money, and maybe even be one of those people who then uses that to pay other people to teach your classes. So I joined 2 labs in Indiana University. One was the Cognitive Development Lab, and another was this Computational Cognition and Learning Lab, which is a mouthful, but just means that I did learn a lot of technical new skills, like computer skills. And one of the things that I learned was what Lindsay mentioned in my bio of learning how to do eye tracking. So now, instead of just testing infants, I would actually study how infants and parents together would interact in more naturalistic environments, and I could see like what they were looking at and what they were doing, what the parent was saying, where the kids were looking in real time. That was really cool. A couple other things that happened while I was there. One, this is what the lab looked like when I left, so this was COVID. So that happened. You all know what that was like. A couple other things though, I also had another big personal life thing, which is I had my first daughter. So this is Savannah, she's 5 now. And I really didn't think that I would be one of those parents. If people find out I'm in developmental psychology and I have kids, they're like, do you do experiments on your kids? And I was like, no, I wouldn't do that. And yet when I was looking for photos, these are the photos that I found. Sometimes I even roped my husband into doing it. This has like a little Lena recorder, so it's recording everything they say as they're talking about this book. So anyway, maybe I am one of those. But I had some other pretty big transformational experiences too. One was through a church that I joined. So I think I just grew in a lot of ways during this time, and I kind of wonder looking back if maybe some of this was maybe even more or as much why God took me here in addition to just the postdoc. So for instance, one of the things I learned through this church, even though I had grown up in the church my whole life, I had not really had a lot of experience with really listening to God. So I don't know if you've ever heard prayer is not just talking, it's also hearing. I always had, I wanted that, but I had a really hard time with that. And for whatever reason, God chose this church to kind of help me grow in things like that. I also grew, I think, a bit in maturity as a person because I went through some kind of hard things. So my husband was out of work for a while, which was stressful. I had a new baby. I had a new baby during COVID, so I was staying home and trying to do work, and that was super stressful. And I was trying to always do it perfectly so that I could feel good about myself and other people would sort of validate how well I was handling everything. And I started to have a lot of anxiety because that was really challenging. And I also, I think for the first time from my perception, had what I would consider some big failures in my life. And that was really hard for me. So one that manifested professionally was as I was nearing the end of my postdoc, I applied for faculty positions. And I applied to a lot of places. And I got one interview. And that could be great, because if that's the one school, that's all you need, right? So I went, and on that interview, I actually found out there was only one other person interviewing. So that's really good odds. And I was not offered the position. So I was yeah, it's good odds, but also kind of makes you feel worse. Looking back, I'm so glad that that happened. I think practically at that point in my life, if I had gotten it, it would have meant I would have moved across the country and away from all of my support, right before COVID hit. With a young kid, that would have been challenging. But more than that, I think for me, it kind of led to a bit of a vocational crisis that I needed to have. I still remember during that time, after that happened, and when I was thinking, what am I going to do next year? Or, do I apply again, and where, and how do I do this? Someone that I really respected, and in academia, which is probably why I listened, said to me something like, why are you pursuing a career to try to make other people happy or to do what other people want you to do? What do you actually want out of your career? What's going to make you happy? What's good for you and your family? And it hopefully seems super obvious to everyone here that that's probably how you should always think about calling and vocation. But for me, that was not that obvious. And I think that that, for the first time, really gave me the excuse to sort of start thinking through some of those things. And what I started to realize is that maybe I didn't want to pursue a faculty position at a big research university where that would be the main emphasis. Not because I don't like research, but because I didn't want it to be only that. And so I mention that because that terrified me. I was so afraid and anxious of how my advisors, for instance, would perceive that and me applying to a place like Hope, for instance. And so I realize more now, I couldn't have maybe named it this way at the time, but I think the reason why it terrified me so much is because I realized I was always not feeling good enough. I was constantly comparing myself to other people. That was, for me, what that big research environment sort of bred in me. And this vocational crisis helped me kind of realize, even if I achieved, you fill in the blank, I don't know what it might be for you, if any of you have felt this way, I wonder if I'll still, not feel good enough. And I think part of the reason why is in that environment, I felt as though, there's always going to be someone who's done more and better, right? If I get a college degree, that's not enough. Now I have to get a postdoc, or a PhD, and then a postdoc, and then the best research grant, and then the best publications, and there's just always more to compare yourself to. So it got me to start really thinking what is enough, and what am I measuring myself by? And go back to that question of what do I really want? What will make me feel fulfilled? And made me realize like I often, and I still do this all the time and struggle with it, like defining myself by societal standards, right? By what other people say, even in preparing this talk, right? Like I've been so anxious, like what are people gonna think about it? Are they gonna approve of what I'm sharing? Thank you, Charlotte, I really appreciate that. That means so much to me, which is why I'm so glad I'm here. But even in that, like I don't want Charlotte's approval to be the thing that tells me, right, that this was okay and that this is what I should be talking about. And like, why do we look to other people so much, right? I don't think this is limited to academia. I think this probably can come out in any profession at any stage. It just kind of took me until this point to kind of be able to name that and realize that. And so, again, I kind of lead up to all of this and share this with you because for me, there's many ways that I've been exploring how my faith and my research intersect, but in thinking about what I wanted to share, I think one of the ones that hits me most personally is that my faith is kind of the antidote to this for me, right? So it's my faith that kind of speaks back to some of these messages and tells me like, oh, I actually am already enough because I was bought for like a very high price, right? I believe that it was Jesus Christ's life that, you know, God spent for me. I was listening to someone recently who said this phrase that nobody spends more on something than it's worth to them. And I've been thinking about that, I think because I have a very analytical mind, and I kept trying to think of all the counterpoints of when you might do that, like just give money away to some charity or something. But even in all of those cases, I think you're still valuing something, right? Even if you give money away, it's because you value the cause or because you value being seen as generous. So I really think in some sense that's true. And for me at least, that kind of hit me in a different way because it helped me really realize like I am already of great worth to God because he spent something very, very precious to save me. And so that also gives me a lot of hope and helps me a lot because that tells me that that happened like before I did any of the things that I already told you about, right? So I don't need to work from a place of trying to prove myself because I'm already of enough worth. So I hope, in case there's anyone else who might struggle with some of those things, that that's helpful and encouraging for you as well. And I would say also, I've been thinking kind of about this term freedom. I think growing up around Christians, I heard the word freedom in the church quite a bit, oftentimes in like you're free from sin or free from the effects of sin or slavery to sin and things like that. But for me, I've just been trying to live more into the idea of freedom in the sense of I'm free to not have to live to prove myself. I'm free to be able to do things like invest in other people and invest in relationships from a place of already feeling secure and confident in myself because of who God says I am. And so, again, I mentioned some of that because that is a big part of what brought me here to be at Hope. I think that not going through that process, I might not have applied for or been willing to accept a position at Hope. Hope is amazing. That's why all of us are here. But at the time, at least from my perspective and some of the messages I had heard, especially a faith-based, like primarily undergraduate institution, was just not the type of thing that would get me. I mean, I had people directly tell me, like, that's not going to get you research fame. You're not going to get prestige. You're not going to get money. And I had to just choose, not only that I didn't necessarily want those, but that I didn't care about the approval that I would get from others by pursuing those. So I invested instead in coming somewhere like Hope, and I'm so excited that I did. So I want to tell you briefly about this sense of broader vocational identity that I've been developing. So I think that this is something that had been growing in me for a while, but I wanted to share just a brief excerpt from one of the readings that we had as part of the Continuum workshops that we did back in May, because it's something that helped me kind of name and formalize something that was already kind of mulling around. So it says, an occupation can provide us with the concrete opportunity to employ our gifts in the service of our neighbors, as God commanded us to do. But then here, it starts to talk about like occupation and how that might be different from vocation. One need not have a paid occupation in order to have a vocation or calling. Indeed, all of us have at any one time a number of vocations, parent, child, citizen, and so on, and only one of them might be pursued as a paid occupation. And so I think this for me was actually helpful, not just in saying that my career and like what I do in terms of research or teaching might be part of, you know, where God is leading me, but also giving a little bit of permission to say out loud that I actually care about a lot more than just my career, right? So I think I would identify like my vocation as relating to research, but also all of those other relationships that I get to invest in at a place like Hope. So being a mentor, being an advisor, a teacher, a colleague, having awesome colleagues who have invested in me and helped me to be at the place where I feel so much like I'm growing in that sense of belonging, wanting to give that back to others. And also where I'm not like pressured or don't feel as much self-pressure to work 80 hours a week and like be drained trying to prove myself, so then I have the opportunity and the energy to invest in other relationships that I feel are also really important and part of what God has, you know, created and called me to be, like being a wife, a mom, a sister, a friend. And so I also think that kind of redeeming this sense of identity has been really helpful and is still helpful, not just for me personally in building like confidence and security, but also I think has a lot of tangible benefits for the relationships and the people that I'm around. So one thing I've realized is that me constantly pressuring myself to like do things really well doesn't actually help me do anything better. It doesn't make me more happy. And I can probably say, I'm pretty sure, you could ask my husband, he would be able to tell you, it doesn't really bring joy to the people around me either, right? The times I'm most stressed and anxious in life. But instead, I think what feeling more confident and secure in Christ does is it helps me work from a place of gratitude, right? Even in the times when I feel like maybe I haven't fully internalized like that worth that God says that I have, I can at least be grateful that he wants to give it to me, and that can help me come from a place where I can look outward and I can really see other people and try to also create and focus on like their growth, right? Not being focused on like outcome or achievement in others either. Actually, a good friend, some very wise person, recently was telling me that one mark of what she considers a great leader is someone who can really celebrate others, right? Really hold them up, even if it puts you not in the spotlight. And I think that that also is something that I really am realizing, like if I'm focused on proving my own worth and kind of my own ego, it doesn't allow you as much to really live into these other things of mentor and teacher. And so, yeah, I'm hoping that that's something that I'll continue to grow in. Okay, and so I mentioned all of that to say, I want to share with you now a bit about the research that I do, but hopefully now I'm learning to do it more from a place of like actual joy and wanting to like bless others and create awesome opportunities for students and things, rather than just because I need to earn publications, right? So I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of what I'm doing now and then have plans to do. So as you may have guessed from these labs that I've worked in, I do developmental cognition research. So I study learning, and that involves things like understanding language, attention, memory, perception, and I do it across the lifespan. So as Lindsay mentioned, from little babies all the way through adults. And if we think for a minute about like, okay, so where does learning take place? What should we study? Learning is happening all the time, right? So even when we're not aware of it, you all are learning information right now. Your brains are taking in lots of things, not just what I'm saying, but smells, everything, right? So there's a lot here. So I have to kind of narrow it down. Some learning takes place in social contexts, in our families. It takes place in more formal settings, like in schools. Maybe this is a college student or you Googling something late at night, right? And I, in the course of my training, have kind of become convinced that a lot of this is really shaped by very early learning experiences, that kind of the trajectory we get set up on very early in life is really important and lays a foundation for a lot of these later learning experiences. And I've also come to believe that so infants and toddlers are really good at learning things, and I think one of the reasons might be because of the structure of the natural environments that they're just embedded into. So for a moment, if you think about, for instance, how you learn your native language or languages, right? It's like natural language immersion, and kids learn language generally, they learn it really well, right? And if you contrast this with how maybe you took a foreign language, like in high school or something, where you're learning to like conjugate verbs, or you have, each week you have a different chapter with different vocabulary. It's just a very different data structure. And if anything, oftentimes what we do is we'll say things like, study abroad, right? Like go immerse yourself. So it's kind of going back to what we might just experience naturally when we're young. And so one of the things I'm interested in is studying young kids, but also thinking about how some of what we learn about those natural learning environments that help kids learn really well, how that also might have some implications for helping us learn even as we get older. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I do. I'm not sure where I am on time, if I have time to like show a couple videos. learned some skills like putting cameras on babies, sometimes also having a second camera that points to an infant's eye so you can see what's in their view. That's kind of like what's highlighted here is like it doesn't always matter what's around the infant, but what are they actually focusing on? Turns out, if you see things from an infant view, is very different from an adult perspective, and that can be really helpful for understanding early learning. And so we can put a camera also pointing toward the infant's eye, which might not be too visible here, but then you can kind of map like where the infant is looking in that scene that's in front of them and figure out what they're looking at. So I'll just show you a video so you can get a sense of kind of what that looks like if it plays here. So this like crosshairs right here is just indicating where those two lines cross is like where the infant is focused. So this is just a parent and child playing with some toys. A lot of the research that I do is on early language learning. Turns out a large portion of children's early vocabularies, those first couple hundred words that kids learn, are names for objects like dog, cup. Kettle is usually a later learned word, but things like that, right? Bottle, ball. Okay, so I don't do this just in environments like that. I think it's important to also kind of bring things into a more controlled environment. So I also do lab experiments that, granted, look a bit more artificial, but to try to test some theories based on what we learn from what learning environments look like in the wild, so to speak. So here's kind of one study that I'm working on right now where we're trying to teach kids to learn words. So you won't hear audio in this video, but we show them some objects and they'll hear names like Modi and Gazer, and we want to see if they can learn them. And then we can see how they are paying attention and how different types of attention, paying attention to larger versus smaller objects, distributing gaze, focusing on one thing, how those types of things might relate to what they learn. The point of gaze on here is really small. If you can see it, I don't know, there's like a little tiny dot that's kind of moving around the screen. But that's some of what I do. Okay. So I want to tell you now, zoom in even more, and just tell you about one line of research that I've become more interested in recently. So in trying to think through, like, what is the natural structure of early learning, and how might that create a really good structure that might be helpful in other contexts as well, I knew from grad school a bit about, if you've ever heard like spacing versus massing or versus cramming, maybe if you're a student, you've heard professors say something like, don't cram all your studying the night before an exam. Right? Maybe you've done that and it's actually helped you on the exam and you actually did okay and you're like, they don't know what they're talking about. Turns out they do know what they're talking about. It's just that what helps you in the long run is if you space out your study more, it'll help you remember for longer. So maybe for like the final exam. So I just illustrate here two kind of classic structures that have been tested a ton in the cognitive science literature. So one would be, say you're talking about or interacting with like a red object. Here, this is one context for play. So you can see these different three-colored objects, red, green, and blue. We didn't tell parents what the study was about. We didn't tell them we were trying to have them teach words to their kids. We just said, play with these objects as you would naturally. And if you want, if it's helpful for you to have something to call these things, you can call them the Habel and the Gazer and whatnot. And we had a little cheat sheet with the pictures for them there. And what I was interested in is like, okay, we know from a ton of research with adults that spacing out is really helpful and that massing is generally not as helpful. What do parents do? Do they tend to like space out how they label the red object? Do they label the red object and then focus on maybe say the name of the blue and then the green and then come back to the red? Or do they like talk a lot about one thing and then move on to something else and like never come back to it? So that's kind of what I went into this looking for. Turns out, oh, so this is a little bit how we do it. So we transcribe parents' speech, right? So we can say, like, maybe this red thing is the mapu. These are all phrases about the red thing, so we can code those as, like, talk about red. And then they switch to talking about blue, and then back to red, okay? So turns out that neither of those structures were actually what tended to happen with real parent-child interaction. It happens sometimes, maybe up to about a quarter of the time, but actually what was much more common is what we call clustered speech. So you'll see here, the parent would say the name of the blue object and talk about that for a bit, and then they'd switch. They'd talk about the red thing, the green thing, come back to blue. And this was a similar type of structure that we also found when they were talking about real objects, like here, a toy turtle and an elephant and a car. So it didn't really matter which context. And the critical thing is that they don't just kind of have a few mentions of one object, like the blue thing, but then they come back to it later and have another cluster of speech. You can kind of see that a little bit here with red, and then another cluster with red. But they don't always do that, right? So maybe for this green object, this one's actually pretty naturally spaced out instead. And what that allowed us to do was, at least in this context where we were examining the impact of this, right? What words did the kid actually learn? What we found is that even for the same parent and infant dyad, if they were talking about more than one thing, the things that they tended to talk about, like the blue object, right, with more clustered speech, that same infant tended to learn those words and show evidence of learning them by the end, and not so much for that same infant, but with a different object that had been talked about with a different timing structure. And so this is something that I just found very fascinating. And looking into it more, there's actually been quite a bit of research now, most over the last 10 up to 15 years, that have documented this type of like clustered pattern in all sorts of things. It turns out that a lot of natural activity, maybe this seems obvious. I feel like sometimes researchers spend a lot of time on things that seem obvious to other people, like things like rainfall, earthquakes. They tend to happen frequently and then not for a long time, and then another cluster, and then not for a long time. Turns out that's also characteristic of a lot of human activity. So it's been documented in things like stock trading, mailing letters, emails, and more recently, some, through our study and a couple others, in like interpersonal communication, verbal communication, nonverbal communication. So anyway, that's interesting. And the thing that, as I looked into it more, I thought was even more interesting is that that's actually not how a lot of more intentionally pedagogically structured materials are actually structured. So when we're trying to teach things to people, like creating workbooks and things, there's actually some research showing that math activities that are created for kids, foreign language textbooks, right? They tend to like focus on one thing, like here's all the addition problems, or here's all the fruit vocabulary. And then they move on to something else and don't always come back to it. And I also just found that interesting. And so what I wanted to do, and what I've been working on recently, is testing these different types of schedules in an experimental setting, right? Because even that study I told you about with infants, we didn't tell parents like, you know, talk about this thing one way and this other thing another way. There could have been other factors that were going on there. So some of the research that I'm doing now, starting with adults, because it's easier to get data faster with adults, so that's usually where a lot of developmental psychologists start. We're teaching things like artists' painting styles. So for instance, students will come into the lab. We have adults from the community coming in as well. And they'll see a bunch of different Pisani paintings, a bunch of different Stratiolate paintings. And we want to know at the end of the study, can they learn to correctly classify if they see a new painting to know who painted it? And we then manipulate some of these artists. We present all at once, like a lot of them all together, so you can get a sense that way in a massed way. Others are more interleaved or spaced out. Others you kind of get clusters. And what we're interested in is what helps with learning. So this is a first experiment that we're doing, and another reason I love being at Hope is the awesome students that I get to work with. So in conjunction with two research assistants, the summer before last, we were developing this project, and one thing that they noticed that I would not have picked up on is that actually, even though there's actually quite a big literature on timing effects, specifically spacing, comparing space to mass, there was no research that we could find that looked at that in individuals with ADHD, which is really surprising because one of the benefits of spacing things out is to promote long-term memory, and that's something that's documented to be a deficit in individuals who have ADHD symptoms. And so anyway, we started digging into this, and so that's one of the things that we're working on right now. If you want to know more about what we're finding, I'll have to tell you about it in the Q&A or a little bit later. I'll jump to just telling you a couple other things we're working on. Because I like studying development, right, and how things kind of change over time. I also had another couple students who graduated last year who helped design a different set of materials, but to ask basically the same types of questions. So not asking children to learn painters' styles, but to show them a bunch of little creatures and try to see, can they learn that these are the crocals and these other things are the gazzers, and learn to distinguish those, and how the timing of how they experience those things might impact that. I'm also working with some other researchers right now to develop a way to test these same types of questions with infants too. So we can kind of compare across the lifespan. And so, like I mentioned before, though, the goal isn't just to test things experimentally, but a part of what I get excited about is also thinking about, again, how this kind of translates back to real-world environments, and also if there's other insights that we can glean, right? I've been focusing on the timing of learning, but there's like a lot of things that happen in real-world interaction. And so some of the work I'm doing right now is also going back to those more naturalistic environments, looking again not just at the language that parents say, but also the types of visual input that children get during the learning process, and how different aspects of that might promote better learning. And so I'll tell you briefly just one finding that I'm working on right now is parents actually have quite a bit of sensitivity to the words, it seems, that they think their child knows, and actually tailor a lot of what they do based on what they perceive their child's linguistic knowledge to be. So if you are able to kind of survey parents about what words they think their child already is able to produce and which ones they aren't, parents tend to talk a lot and say the names of objects that they think their child already knows the name for, and talk less about the things that they don't. But when they do talk about those objects that their child doesn't yet know the name for, they provide much higher quality learning input. So for instance, if I think my kid already knows, I don't know, the word car, I might talk about the car because it's around, but while the child is like staring at their leg and not actually focused on the car, I might just kind of mention it. But if I don't think that my child knows the name for whatever this thing is, then when I talk about it, right, not only might I wait until my child's eye is fixated on it, but I might even wait until they're holding it, or I might do things like point to it to try to like help children learn it. And parents do this while they're like not even aware of it, which is kind of interesting. So anyway, trying to understand like what are the things that parents might do that might help facilitate good learning, word learning in the wild. And so I want to do this not just in these types of contexts, but to also, there's some newer eye trackers that are almost out. They've been like almost out. Oh, COVID. Yeah, I'm waiting still. But they're really cool because a lot of the ones I worked with so far, they still are tethered. So the child will have like this pretty big, heavy cable like goes over to this computer, which is not ideal if you want to get like free movement and yeah. So there's soon going to be something that looks kind of like this, these glasses where the eye tracker is actually embedded into the frame. They already have them for adults and should, hopefully, I know some people who are pilot testing them right now, have them for infants soon. And the idea is then to just be able to expand this research to study natural learning and visual input and auditory input in a broader range of contexts. One that's also really important for early word learning and literacy is reading books, which is where you get exposure to words that you might not ever have exposure to in your other types of environments. And then another thing that I'm excited to try to live into at Hope, which I hadn't really considered prior to coming here, is like how to really integrate undergraduate students into the work that I do, and not just as research students in the lab, but also potentially to use some of this technology in classes and kind of integrating my research and teaching. So for instance, through like an advanced research course or a seminar I teach on embodied cognition to try to get students, to be able to use, I went far, technology like this to collect their own data and kind of identify their own research questions. So, okay. I'll just wrap up by saying kind of where this is going and especially how it's related to what I do at Hope. So my long-term goals are to advance theory. That's what I was kind of trained to do and what every lab that I'd worked in before really focused on. But I think part of what I'm excited to also try to do from a sense of like broader vocation and investing in other people is to try to also really think seriously about practical applications of some of the work that I do. And I'm hoping that by continuing to focus on more naturalistic learning environments, that will naturally lend itself to be more practically generalizable outside of the lab. But also, I think the context of studying early word learning also provides a really cool opportunity. So for instance, we know that as children get older, the size of their productive vocabulary, the number of words they say, goes up. So this is kind of an average trajectory, this blue line here. But something that's fascinating about it is there's huge individual differences. If you look at children that have the smallest and the largest vocabularies, when you consider delays and deficits or differences in socioeconomic background. And it's helpful or like predictive, not just for like where they'll be the next year in terms of their linguistic knowledge and how many words they know, but it's predictive 5, even sometimes 10 years later for like general academic performance, not just in reading, but just scholastically in general. And so I think there's a lot of benefit here if we can try to start to understand what really helps early learning and can get children on the right foot linguistically early on. So potentially having some practical applications for intervention. And I'm also considering now maybe thinking more about formal education too, right? So whether it's things like children's books and kind of the structure of books that might be helpful, or if there's things in terms of the structure of pedagogical materials, whether it's textbooks, which I should not say because Dave Myers is right in the front here, but maybe we'll have some grand ideas. Or maybe it's just something like giving more concrete and specific tips to the students in my classes about how best to study and implement learning. And in all of this, I just want to say thank you to all of the awesome students that I've had the opportunity to work with. That's also something that I'm really excited about continuing to do and focus on. So these are just some of the students that I worked with, some of them who are here. And I'm really excited just to continue to be a mentor and try to provide opportunities for learning some of these skills, but also, I'll conclude by saying also to try to hopefully instill in them while they're still here some of what maybe I wish I had learned a little bit early on, like trying to work from a place of belonging and gratitude. So I just put a couple excerpts from Colossians 3, because this is one chapter that there's a lot there, but I tried to kind of pick out the highlights to give you a sense. It's something that's been meaningful to me in this journey, so I'll just go ahead and read it. It says, "Set your mind on things that are above, not on things that are on earth. Here there is no Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, but Christ is all and in all. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you were called in one body, and be thankful. And whatever you do in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord and not for human masters, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward." It's the Lord Christ that you are serving. So I'll end with that and just say thank you to everyone who's been a part of this.
We have time for a handful of questions. If anyone has something they want to offer or ask.
Yeah, you do.
Lauren, superb job on this. Thank you so much for all the work you put into this. I am hearing all this stuff about large language learning models and artificial intelligence. Are there implications of your research for AI? Because it's all the rage right now. Okay.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I focused a lot on the language learning part right here in what I presented to you today. A lot of actually the training that I did starting when I was in undergrad even was understanding visual perception, and that's why in part I also look at what kids see, not just what they hear. So I actually know more about the implications of understanding kids' visual experiences for AI, and that comes out not necessarily in terms of text-based AI, but more so in terms of visual, self-driving cars and things like that, being able to visually recognize things, which the visual system is really complex. And so there's actually a growing portion of the AI vision community that is actually training these big learning models on images that are collected from these types of head cameras from infant views. And part of the reason why is that to learn a name for an object, for instance, or to recognize that this object is the same as this other one, you have to be able to recognize it from all different types of views. And turns out that because infants tend to get really close to things and they tend to put their hands on everything, they create views where they get lots of different input, where they see things from lots of different perspectives, which is something that, for instance, if you train an AI visual recognition model on just things that are on the internet, what do we post? Things that are always from perfectly framed, white background, not from a lot of different orientations. And so if you actually train an AI visual system with the same types of inputs that a human visual system kind of gets trained up in some ways it can actually outperform a lot of those other models. So I'm sure there's tons of implications there on the language side as well. I'm just I'm not as familiar.
Thanks so much for your talk. I'm thinking back to particularly the first half of your presentation, and I'm thinking about it because I have two high school daughters who are trapped in this cycle of achievement-based sort of self-definition. And I'm constantly telling them to quit everything and just, be a happy human being. I guess my question is what is it that we could do, or what could someone have done for you at a pivotal point that might have helped you think about your vocation in broader terms earlier? That would have worked, right? Because I feel like most of the time if I say, you know, you don't need to be a great cross-country runner, you should just quit so you have time to sleep at night. They don't hear me, and that's partly because of my father. I'm their father, but there's so much built up around our achievement-based identities.
Right. Yeah. So like from a developmental research perspective, right? Parents are often, and like caregivers in general, people who work at daycares and are probably have trainings on not praising their children and being overly positive when they do something, like, oh, good job. I think sometimes that can instill early on, like if I do something good, other people praise me for it, and can sometimes take away from that intrinsic motivation of like, oh, I enjoy doing that just because I enjoy drawing. And so there's some things like that that I think can start really early on that parents could think about. But also, to be fair, like as you were asking that question, I started thinking like, I honestly don't know. Otherwise, it might have been different for me. But something that came to mind is also like, I don't know if it's necessarily a terrible thing to go through that struggle, right? Like I think it kind of plays into this like, oh, we have to get it together and do it earlier and sooner and have the right sense earlier on. And that kind of is part of that same cycle maybe. I don't know, that's kind of meta. But yeah, I just wonder that kind of going through that process, and sometimes like, I feel like that's a really Christian thing too. I'm realizing like, if I really want to grow, it often comes out through things that feel really hard and struggling. And maybe if you don't struggle, then it doesn't mean as much when you get there. So, I don't know. But if you figure out a better answer, share.
In the interest of time and classes and all of you, would you just thank Dr. Slone for me one more time?